anchored some way across the harbor, not far from the breakwater. We came alongside, and I heard the sound of a ukulele. We clambered up the ladder. "I guess he's in the cabin," said Winter, leading the way. It was a small cabin, bedraggled and dirty, with a table against one side and a broad bench all around, upon which slept, I suppose, such passengers as were ill-advised enough to travel in such a ship. A petroleum lamp gave a dim light. The ukulele was being played by a native girl, and Butler was lolling on the seat, half lying, with his head on her shoulder and an arm round her waist. "Don't let us disturb you, Captain," said Winter, facetiously. "Come right in," said Butler, getting up and shaking hands with us. "What'll you have?" It was a warm night, and through the open door you saw countless stars in a heaven that was still almost blue. Captain Butler wore a sleeveless undershirt, showing his fat white arms, and a pair of incredibly dirty trousers. His feet were bare, but on his curly head he wore a very old and very shapeless felt hat. "Let me introduce you to my girl. Ain't she a peach?" We shook hands with a very pretty person. She was a good deal taller than the captain, and even in the Mother Hubbard which the missionaries of a past generation had, in the interests of decency, forced on the unwilling natives, could not conceal the beauty of her form. One could not but suspect that age would burden her with a certain corpulence, but now she was graceful and alert. Her brown skin had an exquisite translucency, and her eyes were magnificent. Her black hair, very thick and rich, was coiled round her head in a massive plait. When she smiled in a greeting that was charmingly natural, she showed teeth that were small, even, and white. She was certainly a most attractive creature. It was easy to see that the captain was madly in love with her. He could not take his eyes off of her. He wanted to touch her all the time. That was very easy to understand. But what seemed to me stranger was that the girl was apparently in love with him. There was a light in her eyes that was unmistakable, and her lips were slightly parted, as though in a sigh of desire. It was thrilling. It was even a little moving, and I could not help feeling somewhat in the way. What had a stranger to do with this lovesick pair? I wished that Winter had not brought me, and it seemed to me that the dingy cabin was transfigured, and now it seemed a fit and proper scene for such an extremity of passion. I thought I should never forget that schooner in the harbor of Honolulu, crowded with shipping, and yet under the immensity of the starry sky, remote from all the world. I like to think of those lovers sailing off together in the night over the empty spaces of the Pacific, from one green, hilly island to another. A faint breeze of romance softly fanned my cheek. And yet Butler was the last man in the world with whom you would have associated romance, and it was hard to see what there was in him to arouse love. In the clothes he wore now he looked podgier than ever, and his round spectacles gave his round face the look of a prim cherub. He suggested rather a curate who had gone to the dogs. His conversation was peppered with the quaintest Americanisms, and it is because I despair of reproducing these that, at whatever loss of vividness, I mean to narrate the story he told me a little later in my own words. Moreover, he was unable to frame a sentence without an oath, though a good-natured one, and his speech, albeit offensive only to prudish ears, in print would seem coarse. He was a mirth-loving man, and perhaps that accounted not a little for his successful amours, since women, for the most part frivolous creatures, are excessively bored by the seriousness with which men treat them, and they can seldom resist the buffoon who makes them laugh. Their sense of humor is crude. Diana of Ephesus is always prepared to fling prudence to the winds for the red-nosed comedian who sits on his hat. I realized that Captain Butler had charm. If I had not known the tragic story of the shipwreck, I should have thought he had never had a care in his life. Our host had rung the bell on our entrance, and now a Chinese cook came in with more glasses and several bottles of soda. The whiskey and the captain's empty glass stood already on the table. But when I saw the Chinese I positively started, for he was certainly the ugliest man I had ever seen. He was very short but thick set, and he had a bad limp. He wore a singlet and a pair of trousers that had been white, but were now filthy, and perched on a shock of bristly grey hair, an old tweed deerstalker. It would have been grotesque on any Chinese, but on him it was outrageous. His broad square face was very flat, as though it had been bashed in by a mighty fist, and it was deeply pitted with smallpox. But the most revolting thing in him was a very pronounced hare lip which had never been operated on, so that his upper lip, cleft, went up in an angle to his nose, and in the opening was a huge yellow fang. It was horrible. He came in with the end of a cigarette at the corner of his mouth, and this, I do not know why, gave him a devilish expression. He poured out the whiskey, and opened a bottle of soda. "Don't drown it, John," said the captain. He said nothing, but handed a glass to each of us. Then he went out. "I saw you looking at my chink," said Butler, with a grin on his fat, shining face. "I should hate to meet him on a dark night," I said. "He sure is homely," said the captain, and for some reason he seemed to say it with a peculiar satisfaction. "But he's fine for one thing. I'll tell the world. You just have to have a drink every time you look at him." But my eyes fell upon a calabash that hung against the wall over the table, and I got up to look at it. I had been hunting for an old one, and this was better than any I had seen outside the museum. "It was given me by a chief over on one of the islands," said the captain, watching me. "I done him a good turn, and he wanted to give me something good." "He certainly did," I answered. I was wondering whether I could discreetly make Captain Butler an offer for it. I could not imagine that he set any store on such an article, when, as though he had read my thoughts, he said, "I wouldn't sell that for $10,000. "I guess not," said Winter. "It would be a crime to sell it." "Why?" I asked. "That comes into the story," returned Winter. "Doesn't it, Captain?" "It surely does." "Let's hear it, then. The night's young yet," he answered. The night distinctly lost its youth before he satisfied my curiosity, and meanwhile we drank a great deal too much whiskey, while Captain Butler narrated his experiences of San Francisco in the old days and of the South Seas. At last the girl fell asleep. She lay curled up on the seat, with her face on her brown arm, and her bosom rose and fell gently with her breathing. In sleep she looked sullen, but darkly beautiful. He had found her on one of the islands in the group among which, whenever there was a cargo to be got, he wandered with his crazy old schooner. The Kanakas have little love for work, and the laborious Chinese, the cunning Japs, have taken the trade out of their hands. Her father had a strip of land on which he grew taro and bananas, and he had a boat in which he went fishing. He was vaguely related to the mate of the schooner, and it was he who took Captain Butler up to the shabby little frame house to spend an idle evening. They took a bottle of whiskey with them, and the ukulele. The captain was not a shy man, and when he saw a pretty girl he made love to her. He could speak the native language fluently, and it was not long before he had overcome the girl's timidity. They spent the evening singing and dancing, and by the end of it she was sitting by his side, and he had his arm round her waist. It happened that they were delayed on the island for several days, and the captain, at no time a man to hurry, made no effort to shorten his stay. He was very comfortable in the snug little harbour, and life was long. He had a swim round his ship in the morning, and another in the evening. There was a chandler's shop on the water front where sailormen could get a drink of whiskey, and he spent the best part of the day there, playing cribbage with the half-caste who owned it. At night the mate and he went up to the house where the pretty girl lived, and they sang a song or two and told stories. It was the girl's father who suggested that he should take her away with him. They discussed the matter in a friendly fashion,